I'm in the middle of a sermon series on our 7 principles. Our principles are not a creed. You don't have to toe the line with them or anything, but we do use them as, to use a Quaker phrase, we use them as a sense of the group. This is a sense of the group that we all can pretty much stand on these principles, and when we covenant in this congregation to become members, one of the things we covenant to do is to live by our 7 principles. One of the principles, number 4, is that we agree to affirm, which means say yes to, and promote, which means to talk about in public, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and society at large. So as a micro and a macro. Here's what some people say about democracy. E.B. White wrote this: democracy is the recurrent suspicion that more than half the people are right more than half the time. J. William Fulbright said, in a democracy, dissent is an act of faith. Howard Winters wrote, civilization is the process in which one gradually increases the number of people included in the term we or us, and gradually decreases the number of people labeled you or them until that category has nobody left in it. So we run this congregation democratically. Our American roots are in New England, and so New England democracy is very much one person, one voice, like a Vermont town meeting. And some Unitarian Universalist church members feel that that is the kind of democracy that we should run our churches with, and the very, very tiny small ones can. If you feel a need to restripe the parking lot, you have a congregational meeting, and you debate the merits of straight lines versus slanty lines. In this congregation, it's of a size where you delegate that to your minister and your staff. This congregation, most congregations meet once a year. This one meets 2. And in your 2 meetings a year, you call your minister, you pass a budget, you elect your board members who represent, you have a representative democracy here, represent your interests as they articulate the goals of the congregation that the minister and staff are supposed to steer the group toward. So the board does that. If we don't like how the board does it, we elect a different board. That's democracy for you. Democracy works best when we trust the process, but Unitarian Universalists are usually of an ilk where we have our doubts about whether one can trust authority or government, and so those doubts sometimes spill over into our church government as well. In some UU churches, you'll hear people say, oh, it's just the rich people that run this church. Or other people say, it's just the retired people that run this church because they have enough time. If I could get to all the meetings, I'd be running this church too. And a true story from a friend of mine in North Carolina, he had 2 members come up to him very irate and say, I think I've told you this story before, some of you, very irate, and they said, we knew it. We knew there was a core committee that ran this church. We've had our suspicions all along, and now we're sure. And he said, a core committee? He said, yes, don't even try to deny it. We heard you talking to Myrtle and Ethel the other Sunday after church, and you were talking about whether to hang that stained glass thing behind the pulpit, and you talked about the core committee, and we just thought we'd confront you and get the truth. And he said, Myrtle and Ethel, the core committee, the stained glass, oh, that was the decor committee. So if you have doubts, you can be reassured there's really not a core committee. All committee meetings are open. If you want to go watch them work, you can, and the board posts its minutes in the hall next to the library every month. Every lapse in that kind of thing should be attributed not to ill will, but to incompetence. odd to think that that would be reassuring. Now, I would stop here, but then we have the macro to take care of. We agree to affirm and promote the democratic process in our nation as well, in our society at large. And we always say that democracy works best when you have an educated populace, but, you know, we work with what we have instead of wishing. And we have a couple of things that we as Unitarian Universalists, along with other people of goodwill, can work on changing if we want to, that would help. I think this first one would help our populace be more educated. It's the reinstatement of the fairness doctrine. The fairness doctrine was passed as a law by the Federal Communications Commission in 1949, and it said everybody who tells a news story, radio, TV, newspaper, has to tell both sides fairly, has to have voices from this side and voices from that side. Well, during the Reagan administration, 1987, the FCC voted to abolish the fairness doctrine, 4-0. So, 1987, the fairness doctrine goes away. 1988, Rush Limbaugh gets on the radio, and the rest is history. We have now right-wing stations and left-wing stations. We have right-wing talk shows and left-wing talk shows, right-wing TV, left-wing TV. We have right-wing facts and left-wing facts. And no one hears the other side. And so all the left-wing people think the right-wing people are just loopy. How can they possibly believe what they believe? And the right-wing people think the left-wing people are just loopy. How can they possibly believe what they say they believe? Everybody is wrong, and not just wrong, but dangerously wrong. And so when, a year ago, Gabby Giffords was shot by a man who listened to a lot of right-wing radio, they started talking about reinstating the fairness doctrine. For some reason, the talk show people are against it. We might want to keep in mind working on it, if that feels like your call. Another problem with democracy right now in our country is this. Corporations have become protected in the same way that people are protected by the Bill of Rights. I have nothing against corporations. Many of them are benign. Many of them do a lot of good in the world, but many of them are somewhat mixed in their goodness. And you can't really even talk about their goodness because they're not people, but they're treated under the law. They gain personhood through aggressive court maneuvers culminating in an 1886 Supreme Court decision, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific. Until then, only people were protected by the Bill of Rights. But now, more and more and more corporations have become protected. They have Fourth Amendment safeguards against warrantless regulatory searches since the 1970s. Fifth Amendment double jeopardy protection, they have it. Sixth Amendment right to trial by jury, now they have it. And so on the surface, when corporations and people have the same rights, you would think, okay, they're equal, they have an equal playing field. The people get to lobby the government for the laws they want. The corporations get to lobby the government for the laws they want. But there's a problem. Many corporations have assets that are larger than the assets of some national economies. Walmart has more assets than Sweden. And so also people get sick and people get tired and people aren't immensely wealthy, most of us, and people die. Corporations, none of that. They don't get sick. They don't die. They have immense wealth. So you have these beings with the same rights, and they're all lobbying for what they want. The corporations have to lobby for their bottom line value, which is that they make more money. And they'll say they owe that to their stockholders. You know, this is our economy. People lobby for a bunch of different values. We have many different varying values. The corporations, one value. So you have these beings that are protected in the same way. These don't die. These have lots and lots of money, and they are wanting to make more money. And these people get sick, they die, they don't have infinite money, and they try their best, but it's really not an even playing field. See what I'm saying? Also, it's really questionable about whether corporations can have a conscience. People have a conscience, most of them. Corporations, I don't think an organization can have a conscience, even a very nice one. They have to have a person who is a conscience with a voice in that corporation. Okay, so, and under rights granted to them by the Supreme Court, corporations have limited liability, and while their employees can be tried in criminal court, while we as individuals can be tried in criminal court, corporations themselves cannot. That's not really even Stephen either. One lawyer said, corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow. And the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. That lawyer was Abraham Lincoln. I want to talk to you also just tiny little briefly about another issue, and that is electronic voting machines that are not validated by paper ballots. We have Unitarian Universalists, one in particular, Teresa Hummel, who is a computer expert, who's working state by state, trying to get paper validation of computer ballots. Because many people say, well, they're computers, they don't make mistakes, so you can trust them. But Teresa Hummel has worked in the computer industry since 1967, and she has a little demonstration that she takes around from state to state, and she shows people how you can cheat using computers. And many UUs are also working on trying to make it illegal for the chair of a state political party to also be the chair of the Board of Elections, whose job it is to ensure free and fair elections. That just seems like a no-brainer, but it's not. So, if you feel called to work on that, please do. Now, I like for my sermons to have something to do with church, to give you something useful. And so I'm going to talk about how this church and others like it, I believe, work to train people for freedom and work to make them dictator-proof. There is a wonderful book that I just read this week by a scholar at the Albert Einstein Institute named Gene Sharp, and it's called From Dictatorship to Democracy. It's a little book, and he wrote it because some people in Myanmar asked him to write a book about how they could overthrow their dictator. He said, I don't know enough about Myanmar to write a book about you guys, but I'll write a general how to overthrow a dictator kind of book. And that book has been passed from hand to hand and mind to mind and computer to computer, and it is said to be the book at the root of the Arab Spring uprising and also the Occupy movement in the U.S. So this is a powerful little book. One dictator called it a bomb of a book. I would say a seed of a book. He said, here's how you keep your people dictatorship-proof or how you overthrow the dictator. You have strong social institutions like churches and clubs and teams. You have institutions that bring people together. You feed people's determination to be free. You teach people critical thinking. You teach them to question authority. You teach them that just because an order comes down from on high doesn't mean that God wants you to obey it. See where I'm going with this? Our Unitarian Universalist religious education is dictatorship-proofing our children, who are kind of dictatorship-proof anyway, as you have known from trying to raise them in your homes. My children were good at defying authority and negotiating. Some would call it arguing, but I chose to think of it as negotiating. And I thought if I could just flip a switch when they're 16 and make this turn on, that would be so much more restful for me, but it doesn't work that way. And so churches like ours teach our children the things they need to know in order to be dictatorship-proof. We teach planning and we teach organizing for justice. We train our own conscience and those of our children, and we teach ourselves and our children to trust our conscience. The rights of conscience and the democratic process, as Tom said, it's not just nice to have that. It's crucial to the survival of our people and the people of the world. We are in a place where our scriptures include poetry, like this one from Hafiz. We have not come here to take prisoners, but to surrender ever more deeply to freedom and joy. We have not come into this exquisite world to hold ourselves hostage from love. Run, my dear, from anything that may not strengthen your precious budding wings. Run like hell, my dear, from anyone likely to put a sharp knife into the sacred, tender vision of your beautiful heart. We have a duty to befriend those aspects of obedience that stand outside of our house and shout to our reason, oh, please, come out and play. For we have not come here to take prisoners or to confine our wondrous spirits, but to experience ever and ever more deeply our divine courage, freedom, and light. And now let there be an offering taken to sustain and to strengthen this place where such things can be read and such things can be said, where our children are taught and we ourselves are taught and challenged, taught to be free.